Brazil is the 5th largest country by territory. It occupies half of South America, being as big as all its Spanish-speaking countries combined. But historically, there should have not been any Portuguese trace in this part of the world. Spain and Portugal started the era of great discoveries, and they dominated the ocean in the 15th century. And to flex on everyone else, they simply split the world by drawing a line across the globe, which is known as the Pope Meridian, because, the Pope approved it. Everything to the west went to the Spanish and everything to the east to the Portuguese. But then the Portuguese suggested to redraw it slightly to the west, just in case. And the Spanish were like, if that makes you happy. But then just a few years later, a Portuguese ship stumbled upon a piece of American land just eastward from the line. That did not alert the Spanish though, because they still had like 90% of the continent. What could potentially go wrong? It must have gone wrong at some point. When and why did Brazil go blowfish, and why did the Spanish overlook that? But before that, let's imagine what would have been had Brazil stayed all east to the line. Let's call this alternative smaller Brazil Brasilinho. The country would take up 11 states in full and 5 in part. 7 out of 10 largest cities, including the capital, Brasilinho, is about 2 million square kilometers, which is about a quarter of the greater Brazil size, but it takes up 2/3 of its population, 3/4 of the GDP, which makes it the 12th biggest economy, the 10th most populous, and the 12th largest country. Just one Denmark bigger than Mexico, but a whole Texas smaller than Argentina. Geography sets the rules for history. In the case of Brazil, the coastal mountains make harder for the early Brazilians to go into the continental interiors. But those were nothing compared to what stood in the way of their competitors. Even now, with all the technological progress, the Andes serve as a huge barrier for the South American countries. And so it was easier for the Portuguese to penetrate Amazonia, and at their disposal was the largest river system in the world. In 1580, Kingless and weakened Portugal signed a union with Spain. The former rivals now were essentially one country, and so the borders became irrelevant. And so the Brazilians could freely go beyond the Pope Meridian into the Amazonia. And when the union broke up in 1640, they simply rejected to leave the lands. Nevertheless, Spain did not stick to the rules either. With centuries passing, each side began to violate the treaties. A bit here, a bit there, just like kids steal from the box of chocolate, thinking that mommy would not notice. But eventually that became too obvious, and so new treaties were signed, where the illegally claimed lands were mutually accepted. They said like, we're fine with that. Keep that and we keep this. And so Spain got, for instance, the Philippines, and this is how Amazonia officially joined Brazil. Other European countries did not care about the treaties made between just Spain and Portugal. First, the French and then the Dutch shamelessly attempted to get a piece of the continent. Easier said than done. The pissed off Brazilians knocked them out, and all by themselves without any assistance from Portugal. Relationships between Portugal and Brazil were complicated. Despite the fact that the colony was gigantic, the metropole kinda ignored it. Such a vast territory seemed little to offer to invest in its exploration and exploitation. Portugal, on the other hand, always lacked finances, as well as strong colonization ambitions. Lisbon's interest in Brazil began to fade just a couple of decades after its lucky discovery, and the interest was shifting back to Asia, basically leaving the American colony on its own, with all their needs and struggles. Then, all the gold and diamonds went across the Atlantic, and to make things worse, the Brazilian market was filled with English goods bought on the very gold from the very soil, and thus killing local enterprise. The boiling point was near. By 19th century, Brazil became ever so self-aware and just needed a suitable moment to flip off Portugal. And such a chance was given by the French. In 1808, Napoleon invaded the Iberian Peninsula. The Portuguese king fled over the ocean, but once things started to settle in Europe, the Portuguese people needed king back. But the prince, his son, decided to take advantage of this opportunity and declared himself no less than the Emperor of Brazil. And so, the biggest colony ever had become independent without much bloodshed. Had they done it before, Brazil would have not stayed one country due to lack of centralization experience. In this parallel universe, South America is likely to have an equal number of Portuguese and Spanish-speaking countries. And if the meridian was not slightly moved to the west, the Portuguese would have not had much ground and cracks to take over half-continent. Brazil is a country which existence defies many rules of politics, geography, and even plain logic. Its history sure had dark pages, which might have been the price Brazil had to pay in order to become such a historical miracle.